So I'm here with several hats today. I work both with Corentin at Liege University, which is a Belgian university, and I actually live and work in France. And my other employer is ITAB, which is the French Institute for Organic Food and Farming. And so with Corentin, we're traveling around some parts of the United States for 2 weeks now for a project named Dynaversity. And the overall objective of this project is to give recommendations to favor a European network for crop diversity and the in situ management of crop genetic diversity. And so our particular perspective is an interdisciplinary one. So I'm an agronomist by training, and Corentin is a sociologist. And we are trying to understand how people network around seed and around crop diversity, and what it is that favors that networking while keeping and maintaining actually the differences and specificities of people. Because the idea is not to have like a network where everyone becomes the same, but to have a network of diversity as concerns plants and concerns people.
Stéphanie?
Yes?
Just for clarity, does everyone know what in situ conservation means? So it's a term that's used to describe conservation of diversity by keeping it used and alive and interacting with it, as opposed to ex situ, which is like a seed bank. So seed bank is conserving on a shelf of the genetic diversity, and in situ is conservation through its utilization.
Yeah, most partners in this project have been working on crop diversity and working with farmers on crop diversity and participatory plant breeding and so on for quite a few years. The Dynaversity project is that we've met initiatives in Europe, and now we're in the US to meet people from Organic Seed Alliance and from Seed Savers Exchange to confront what we learned in Europe with what's happening in the US and see what that teaches us about what goes on in Europe. And so many of the partners in this project have been working on crop diversity for quite some time with farmers, and in the French case, so I work in France, this has also led us to start thinking about plant health and how in these seed networks and with this local on-farm seed production, how we manage plant health and in particular seed health. So as far as concerns those plant diseases that are seed-borne. So I'll give you a short presentation on that. And I've named the presentation as Avoiding Disease Favor Plant Health, which can be, a bit confusing. But I've named it this way because it's actually a seed producer with whom I spoke during this research I've been doing, who said, well, that he wasn't sure that avoiding disease favored plant health. So to explain you how I got into thinking about plant health, I should explain very briefly the legal framework of seed production and seed marketing in Europe. And it's actually mainly three regulations that have an effect on the seed market. The first is the regulation on the marketing of seed, which is something that doesn't exist in that form in the US, which actually regulates which varieties are allowed to be marketed. It also regulates seed quality characteristics and what germination standards and so on. But it's the main thing is that it regulates what varieties are allowed to be put on the market. So seeing how it happens in the US has been a real eye-opener for us, and that's really interesting, but that's not what I'm going to talk about today. And another important regulation is the plant health one. But in Europe, actually, we're discussing so much about the seed marketing rules and about the injustices of it being able to put only some varieties on the market that we don't tend to discuss this plant health one very much, which mainly regulates what pests and diseases are quarantine pests and are not allowed to enter Europe. And then there's the regulation on official controls, which basically says how the controls of these two regulations are being done. And so actually I started thinking about plant health in 2012 when a group of vegetable seed producers which are called the croqueurs de carottes, which means literally the carrot munchers. They're an association of small-scale, independent, artisanal vegetable seed producers who mainly work with heirlooms. And they were getting quite worried about this plant health regulation because they were seeing that in the regulation for the marketing of seeds, there were actually some openings, and they were getting a bit more freedom, but they were afraid that on the plant health side, things would get stricter, and that would make it more difficult for them to put seeds on the market with their handcraft, artisanal, way of doing. That's actually what triggered my thesis research on the topic. And so at the beginning, when I started working with them and discussing with them, I was thinking, well, they probably just have other tools to get healthy plants and healthy seed, and that it was just about the tools to obtain the same result. That, for example, they couldn't treat with conventional seed dressings, and that they were using other tools. But then eventually, discussing with them, I figured out that actually it wasn't so much just about how to get to a result, but for them it was very much also about their approach to plant health and their actual definition of plant health and what they regard as plant health. And that approach was very different from what the plant health regulation was trying to impose upon them. And there's actually the work of a researcher, a paper which I found really interesting by Döring, who speaks of conceptions of plant health and inspires from philosophy of human medicine to describe the different conceptions of plant health that exist. And so he argues that there can't actually be one single definition of plant health, and that there's many aspects actually to be taken into account when we try to define plant health. And so he describes different ways of approaching plant health in general and health in general and plant health in particular. And so one of the contrasts he shows is, for example, a naturalist approach as opposed to a normativist approach. So to give you an example there, it means that a naturalist approach would say that, okay, plant health is actually an objective entity that exists out there. It's something that we can measure. And so we just have to describe it and define it. Whereas a normativist approach would say that actually behind how we define plant health and what we consider healthy, there are cultural values. So one example for that is, I don't know what you call it in English, but there's a disease on corn that does ustilago. Yeah, smut. And we consider it as disease, but if you go to Mexico, they eat this. And so for them, it depends on your cultural background whether something is really considered a disease and good or bad. Another tension is, for example, a negative definition of plant health or a positive one. A negative definition is easy. It means healthy. A plant is healthy if it doesn't have disease. And a positive one would try to say, well, what are the positive attributes? What does a plant have to have? What is it able to do if it's healthy? So you might say, well, it has to be able to reproduce on itself, or look vigorous, or, well, anything positive. Some would even say a plant is healthy if it is able to evolve towards health. It might be sick at a moment, and then if it evolves towards health, we can consider that it's healthy. So that would be more a positive approach. Then you can also see reductionist approaches as opposed to holist approaches. So reductionism just means that you assume that you can explain a system by looking at its parts. And a reductionist approach to plant health would be to look at a single disease. So to see if a plant is tolerant or resistant to a single disease, whereas a holistic approach would try to look at the global health. Because we know that, for example, a plant that is attacked by one disease might also become more vulnerable to another disease. So this is a good example of showing that there's more to the system than its parts. Then there's the debate about functionality or resilience. And this is very much about how human beings interfere with a plant. A functional approach would be to say, well, if I spray my plants with the pesticides and I keep them healthy that way, they're functional, and so I consider them healthy. A resilience approach would be to say, no, I consider, if a plant is healthy only because I sprayed it, I don't consider it healthy. I consider a plant healthy if it's resilient. Another debate is about materialism or vitalism. So can plant health be explained simply by looking at the molecules and at the material side of a plant? Other people would say that there are life forces in a plant, like in Chinese traditional medicine you would call it qi, or in biodynamic breeding they look at these forces. And so you can debate on whether that influences plant health or it doesn't. And one last debate one can have is about biocentrism or anthropocentrism. So that's when you think about plant health, if you have a biocentrist view, that means if you don't take into account what is important for humans, you could debate whether you even want plant health, because then you could say, why is our crop more important than the bacteria that also needs to live? So that's a biocentrist approach. Or you can say, well, I'm interested in the crop. So what I'm interested in the health of the plant and not of the bacteria. And so the basic conclusion of this work, which has inspired me really a lot, and that has been an eye-opener as I was working with these seed producers and wasn't quite getting what they were worrying about and what the issue was. And his main conclusion is that plant health is more an instigator of thought and debate than something that we can actually define as something objective. And so from there, I continued working with these seed producers, and the objective of my research became to understand their approach about plant health and the values and the objectives that they had when they were working with plants and their health. So this picture, this photo for me is really emblematic. For me, it's really visual of how these farmers work. And for them, I mean, here he's just pulling out in his bean crop a bean that's, off type. But that's not what's important. What's important is that you can see that his bean crop is actually not in very good shape. It's not very healthy. Well, it has a bacteria. And for him, what's important is to observe his crop in the field and see the plants in interaction with their environment. And he considers, I know from having talked for hours with him, that just analyzing a seed and knowing whether this specific bacteria, so it's a blight disease, whether the Pseudomonas bacteria that causes that disease is on the seed or not is not the central information for him. So it gives an information, but what he needs to know is whether when he sows the seed in his soil, whether the plant can live with the bacteria and outgrow it or not. And this goes together with a collective management. So that means that, for example, for him, when he grows this bean or whatever other crop, locally it might take another type of risk, because when you know that your seed doesn't have the bacteria and you sow it, you should be fine. But when you're in this approach, the network and the collective is really important, because it means that if in one place a bean crop is, doesn't grow very well, other people in the same network are growing the bean as well, and that this gives security, in particular for these farmers growing heirlooms that sometimes aren't very, present in great quantities anymore, and so this brings also security for genetic diversity. And so what I concluded from that work was that their way of managing plant health in this group of independent seed companies also is intrinsically linked to how they manage crop diversity, and that we need to take into account these diverse plant health approaches and the effect that they have on diversity when setting up legislations, and just that we have to be aware that if we impose a certain approach to plant health, we probably also affect the crop diversity that these groups are maintaining. Since then, so that work finished in 2017, I've continued this reflection on plant health on other crops. So I just wanted to give you a few examples before finishing. One is on bread wheat, common bunt. So common bunt is a fungus that is seed-borne and which is quite feared especially in organic farms, and it had actually in conventional farming, it had almost disappeared because through the seed dressings, it was under control and people weren't actually used to seeing this disease anymore. And with more organic farming at the beginning, because people weren't used to observing this disease anymore, on some farms, it got a bit out of control. And so organic farmers had to learn again how to observe this plant disease and how to, react in time if they were having it in their seedlots. And so with a group of...
The same thing is true in the U.S. In grain production. It's a concern across the U.S. and there's researchers trying to get a grip on, how it's being managed by farmers, and it's very parallel.
And actually, I don't know how it's in the US, but in Europe, so this was an issue, I would say, 2010, 2011, there were lots of discussions about those organic farmers spreading common bunt and not knowing what they were doing. And actually then for a couple of years, there's been quite some research on seed dressings that we could use in organic farming. And it's quite by using white vinegar, some use copper treatments. There's also mustard powder that's allowed in the EU for organic farming. And most people feel that it's under control. And so I've started this work with a group of the Réseau Semences Paysannes, which is the French network for farmer seeds, to work on this disease, because actually, usually the usual recommendation is, well, if you do get common bunt, just stop making farm seed and buy fresh certified seed and you're fine. But with these farmer seeds who are maintaining, heirloom varieties or farmers varieties, you can't do that, because if you lose your seed, you lose 5, 10, 20 years of breeding for adaptation. And so actually what we've identified objectives at 2 timescales. The first is, informing about the seed dressings and techniques and things to look out for in organic farming. And the other is more a long-term perspective, because actually some organic farmers who really want to base their farming practices on ecological interactions and so on are not satisfied with relying on seed dressings to have healthy plants, and are thinking there must be some way that we can strengthen either our plants or improve our practices to make the ecosystem healthy, and somehow that the healthy ecosystem makes healthy plants and suppresses this disease. And so that's a second step. And for now, I've just been interviewing some farmers about innovative things they've been trying out. Another reflection we've had, which is just at the very start, concerns virus management on seed potatoes. This is quite similar in the US and in the EU. For seed potatoes, there's a very strict level of virus that's allowed in the seed potatoes, because, certain viruses, because they're transmitted through the seed potato, through the tubers. And so the certified seed potato production relies on systematic meristem culture to rid the potatoes of the virus. And so a group of organic seed potato growers came up to us to explain that they were very unsatisfied with this, because they consider that in a truly organic approach you should be linked to the soil all the time.
By the seed,
that's fine.
The on-farm seed exchange.
That's fine.
Sorry, let's do a deal back here.
That's fine, that's what it's all about. And so this group of organic seed producers felt unsatisfied with this systematic reliance on meristem culture. Do you know, should I explain meristem culture? Or basically it means when you have a potato plant that has this virus, the virus is in the entire plant, except for the very tip of the stems, so where the plant is growing. And in that very tip where you have undifferentiated cells, so that means cells that haven't decided yet if there'll be a leaf or a root, and so that part the virus never gets there, because it grows so quickly that it outgrows the virus. And so meristem culture is taking just that very tip, those cells and growing it on an in vitro medium. And then eventually those cells form a plant again with small tubers that are guaranteed virus-free. And so every few generations they have to go through that process again because the plants always accumulate virus. And so these farmers were interested in finding alternatives. I mean, it's really complicated because having discussed with some people who know US tuber production, it's the same here. It's a very locked-in system, and the whole system is really based. One of the main focuses is on this virus management, and legally it wouldn't be easy to not do this meristem culture. But for example, at the moment, more like as a reflection and as in a research perspective, we've started thinking about this topic. And yeah, for now, there's been a student who has been going around interviewing people who are trying to have, who have systems that are alternative to the meristem culture-based system in Western countries. And finally, we're also beginning, this one you might know, bacterial canker. So bacterial canker, which is Clavibacter michiganensis on tomato, is a quarantine pest in the EU. I don't know whether it is here too. So that means that it's extremely controlled, and that any seed carrying Clavibacter is not allowed on the seed market. And so actually the same group, some of the independent seed companies with whom I've worked on the bean plant health have had controls on tomato seeds that they had a few that were positive with Clavibacter. And they were very surprised, and even the people working for the official body controlling this were very surprised because they had seen nothing on the plants. The plants looked extremely healthy. And so this has started a reflection on whether these are organic, very diversified systems with very healthy soils. And so our hypothesis is that maybe these systems are actually able to suppress this bacteria, and that this would be evidence that perhaps this idea of eradication, that not unnecessary, but that it applies to a certain system. And that perhaps in small-scale systems, it's also a notion of risk, because these small independent seed companies, they sell either to gardeners or to small-scale diversified vegetable farmers, and that the notion of risk might not be the same. So it's, these are just, discussions and reflections going on. Of particular interest now at the moment, because actually the plant health regulation, a new plant health regulation has been voted in 2016 and will come into effect at the end of this year. So actually that means that regulated non-quarantine pests that weren't needing a plant passport until now will be needing a plant passport. And so that explains also this fear of the independent seed companies, that they will have a more difficult time with their means as handcraft producers to be able to put seed on the market. And also registration of all operators will become, so that's all, anyone putting seed on the market or putting seed on the market will have to be registered. So they just fear additional bureaucratic burden. And that's all. Thank you.